A little over 10 years ago or so, my best friend was getting married. And so as his best friend, I became his best man, which gave me the responsibility of coming up with what to do for his bachelor party. Now, had this happened, 3-4 years before this time, I would have probably chosen to do something stupid, sinful, maybe even illegal. But the difference was when he asked me to become his best man, to serve as his best man, I was following Christ at that time. And so I was like, well, what can I do to do something cool, but not like dumb or sinful? So we decided, okay, you know what? None of us have ever been to San Francisco before, so we got a couple of us guys, and we took a road trip from Southern California up to San Francisco. Now, if you've ever been to California, you know that there's a couple of ways that you can choose to go from Southern California up to Central California or up by San Francisco. You could take the 101 or you could take the 1. And it was kind of funny because I was thinking about this last week, or a week ago, my wife and I went to Arkansas, and we were visiting her family that, grew up in California with us and stuff. And as we were talking, it was like we kind of noticed that in California, when you say to take freeways, it's like take the 60 to the 57 to the whatever, use the before the number. And everywhere else in the country, we don't say that, right? We don't say take the 74. We say take 74 to 474. So it's like, I don't know, Californians are weird. So anyway, we decided to take, not just for that reason, so we decided to take the 1, which is also known as PCH or Pacific Coast Highway, the scenic route, the long way up north, but the more beautiful way. It's not the world's most beautiful drive, because that name is already taken, but it is a very beautiful drive to go up the coast of California. Now, as we were on our way up there, I started noticing that, you have these amazing views of the ocean and rocks and cliffs. And, as you can see from the picture there, it's really a beautiful drive. And I thinking about that this week and just the ocean and the rocks and the cliffs and things like that. It's beautiful to look at until it gets dark, because then it just kind of gets scary. You can't see anything, but that same ocean and rocks and cliffs are still there. It really wouldn't take a whole lot more than just a slight jerk of the wheel or, nodding off for just a half a second for you to be plunging hundreds of feet into the darkness to your death, right? So it's kind of a dangerous road. Now, the way you navigate that is you trust things like your headlights, right? You trust the signs that are there. You trust the reflectors, the lane dividers, okay? And sometimes you'll have somebody coming against you, and the idiot will forget to turn their brights off, and it's like, dude, I can't see. And so you're kind of like watching the guardrail on the side and like following that as you go, because you want something to trust in spite of something shining in your face, right? And as I'm thinking about that, it makes me think of our life with God and what it's like to navigate those kind of roads, right, where things are treacherous. And you find yourself thankful that there's something to trust, in spite of the fact that sometimes, the idiots of the world leave their brights on, and the shiny things of this world that distract you will be shining in your face so that you can't see. Or sometimes we're too tired as we're going to pay attention to where we should be going. Or sometimes we're scared and we're looking for something to trust. And just like the headlights in our car light our path, we have God to illuminate our path. And yet, when I look at the road to life that all of us are driving on, I see a lot of people pulled over to the side, right? Too afraid to keep going, or too tired, and so they're just sleeping, or broken down, or fallen off the side of a cliff. And I'm not talking about unbelievers here. I'm talking about Christians that are living that way. Why? Why do Christians live that way? Well, actually, the answer is simple. Because a lot of Christians believe in a God that they don't trust. They believe in a God that they don't trust. I heard Dr. Tony Evans say that, and I thought that was a really interesting point. That for some reason they've disconnected their belief in God from their walk with God. In James 2:18, James says, "But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.' You believe that God is one, you do well. Even the demons believe and shudder." So, church, belief is important. It's very important, but God intends for us to do something with our belief. It's not supposed to just sit there and just be your belief. It should create some sort of an action. And so rather than believing in God and walking alone, we are supposed to trust that God that we believe in to guide our steps and to direct us. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. If you're following along with your YouVersion Bible app, you can open up the app and find today's event. Today's message is called, "What Did You Do That For?" And we're in Genesis chapter 16, looking at the first 16 verses. So let's go ahead and hop in right here to Genesis 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. Now, this Egyptian maid that we're talking about here, this Egyptian servant, was probably a leftover from when they had gone to Egypt before. If you remember a few weeks ago, Abram and Sarai and all of them went into Egypt because there was a famine in the land, and they freaked out when they shouldn't have done that. They should have been obedient to God and kept staying in the promised land, but they left and went to Egypt, and they lied about Sarai and all that kind of stuff. And eventually when they figured out that Sarah was actually Abram's wife, Pharaoh was like, well, get out of here, and he treated them well. In Genesis 12:16 it says, "And for her sake he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female servants, like Hagar, female donkeys, and camels." So what's happening here is this servant from Egypt probably becomes a surrogate mother, okay? So it's like, this was apparently very common back then, where a woman that was of prominence couldn't have a child, and so they would bring in a surrogate mother to have the baby for her. So this would, in essence, be Sarah's kid, but she would not be the one carrying the kid, okay? Now, there's something interesting that I want us to take here. If you grabbed your Connect card on the way and you're going to fill in your blanks, here's your first one. First one is, we have choices in who we trust. We have choices in who we trust. Now, we all know people that we don't trust, right? A guy that I grew up with named Dusty is a guy that I don't trust. And the reason why is he had this habit of saying like, "Hey man, let's go do this thing." And I'd be like, "Man, I don't think that's legal. I don't think we should do that." I'd be like, "No, man, I talked to a cop. It's totally okay. We should go do it." And then we do it, and then we get pulled over, and the cops would be like, "You can't do that." And then I'd be like, "Dusty, you said you talked to a cop." And he goes, "Well, how should I know?" That was his line. How should I know? He always said, "How should I know?" And it was like, you don't have to know, but you don't have to tell me that you do know, okay? So I learned, don't trust Dusty, right? Don't do what he says. Then there are some people that you sometimes trust, like my brother Kevin, right? If I would say, "Hey, Kev, can you come over and help me build this deck?" He would be there to help me with the deck 3-4 hours late, okay? So he would be there. He would just be late. So you can sometimes trust him. But then there are people in your life that you can always trust. I will always trust my mom. If she said she's going to be somewhere to help me with something, and like a nuclear bomb went off, and like she was stuck in traffic with like mangled mess of cars, she would crawl through the radiation on her hands and knees across the burning asphalt to make sure she was there on time. Like, I trust my mom, okay? So the truth is, when you get to know people, you have to learn who you're going to trust and who you're not going to trust. But what's interesting here is the person that Sarai is failing to trust is God. So what happens when God tells you he's going to do something, and then you struggle to trust him? Now, I think there's actually some good reason here. So let's see where we're at here. I think Sarai wants to trust God here, but time is stirring up doubt for her, right? Like when she first heard the promise, I think, she probably believed, but now she's really having trouble. Let's look at verse 3. It says, "So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife." Okay? So this says that this has been 10 years since they've been to Canaan. All right? Now, a lot of scholars will say that this is actually a result of them. Remember, they weren't supposed to go to Egypt. They're supposed to stay in the promised land. Okay? So some people think, well, God, as a punishment, extended the birth of Isaac for 10 years at this point. Okay? And maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but here's what I know. Either way, God still intends to fulfill his promise. And they still need to be trusting him for his promise, but they're not. Instead, they're saying, well, hey, let's get this servant to come in and be a surrogate mother. They're not trusting God. This is very important that we understand. This was not God's idea. God didn't say, hey, why don't you go ahead and have Ishmael with a slave woman? Okay, that was not his plan at all. And when I think about this, I started thinking about how humans are versus how dogs are when it comes to trusting, right? Has anybody in here ever trained a dog to do a trick before? Okay, some of us, all right. So a lot of times, right, you want to train your dog like, roll over, play dead, bite the mailman, whatever. And it's like, you tell them to do something, right? And then you give them a treat if they do it. Okay, so you're communicating with them that there was a reward for doing your will, right? What's interesting about that is over time, the dog learns, okay, if I want to be rewarded, I have to do what he wants me to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this because this is what he wants. I don't think dogs get around after the fact like, let's philosophically discuss why it is the owner wants me to roll over and play dead. And they have long conversations. And I'm not sure that I'm going to, I'm going to question you, owner, because I don't know that this is worth it. What are you trying to accomplish? The dogs don't question. They just know that you're trustworthy and they're obedient. Honestly, I think we would be better off being a little bit more like dogs and a little less like people sometimes. Because God has already shown that he's trustworthy, and yet we like to sit back and go, yeah, but I don't know, what's he really accomplishing here? Let's dilute what the scriptures say so that it feels a little bit better for me so that my will can be met. And we make it all about us and what we want and what we understand instead of just saying, you know what, God, you are trustworthy and I trust you and I'm going to be obedient even if I don't understand. The dog never learns why, they just learn to obey. And so what's going to happen here is now that Sarai is stepping in and trying to help God out, right? Because God already said you're going to have a kid, and she's like, well, maybe God wants me to do this dumb thing, and that will make it happen. So what that's actually going to do, this helping out, is actually going to delay Isaac's birth for another 10 years after, or 13 years after this. So this is just pushing it back. And actually this happens a lot to Israel. If you look at Numbers 14:22, this is when God had told them, you're going to go into the promised land and take the promised land. And they all came back like, I don't think we can do that, guys. And here's what God says in Numbers 14:22. None of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have yet put me to the test these 10 times, and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give their fathers. And none of those who despise me shall see it. So God says, yeah, you were going to go into the promised land, but because you're disobedient and despise me, you don't get to go. In Matthew 12:38, Jesus is talking to the scribes and the Pharisees that are questioning him. Verse 38, then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. Jesus is basically saying, are my signs not enough for you? I've come here, I have proven who I am, now I expect you to listen, not continue questioning and asking for proof. He says the only thing you're going to get now is when you see me resurrected from the dead. That's what the sign of Jonah is, 3 days in the belly of the earth. 1 Samuel 13:13, and Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, which we commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Basically what was happening there was Saul was impatient. He wanted to go fight a battle, and he ends up doing the sacrifices that the priests were supposed to do because he was impatient. And Samuel the prophet says, well, guess what? Because you took things into your own hands, none of your kids are going to be king. Your generation or your descendants are going to be stomped out because God wants a king who's after God's heart, not a king who's after his own. So what do all those things have in common? God changed the plan, if you will. He changed the actions because we tried to take control. When humans try to grasp it and take control and do things themselves, God is very willing to turn things around. What we need to learn from that is that we shouldn't be trying to take control from God. God knows what he's doing. He has never once failed. He doesn't need you to fix his problems for him. He doesn't need you to come up with excuses or explain away his will. He just needs you to trust him and be obedient. I remember when I was I was in college. I was only like a year and a half into my bachelor's degree. So I didn't even have a bachelor's degree yet. And I was praying to God like, Lord, I want a ministry. Please, Lord, make me a kids pastor or a youth pastor or a senior pastor or like Archbishop of the world. Lord, just give me a ministry. Give me something, Lord. And it's like, you barely are in college. Like, why are you asking for this big return? But I felt for some reason in my heart in that moment that I was ready to be a pastor. And it was like, please, Lord, please. And God's answer was, no, you're not ready yet. And as much as I wanted to manipulate and make it happen, I just prayed. And eventually, a couple months later, I actually got a ministry opportunity. And I was like, oh, I see why that was a bad idea. I wasn't ready. And the more I wanted to try to force and tweak it so that my will was fit into the situation, the more God was like, you need to hold off. See, God sees the whole picture of what he's doing. I was a year and a half into school thinking that, the sky was the limit, and I was ready to go all the way to step 10. Why do we do this as humans? Why do we do stuff like that? Honestly, we want control because we're afraid of what God is going to do with his control. So we try to change it. And it's interesting that we worry so much, but actually we should follow Martin Luther's advice. He said this. He said, pray and let God worry. That's a good idea. That's what we should be doing. Let him worry about the plan and where things are going, and we just pray and just keep moving. He'll take care of it. Let's go on to verse 4 here. About Abram, so he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Okay. So, first of all, you should know that this was not like an affair, not some secret thing. As a matter of fact, it's very likely that they were following a typical custom of the day, that when Abram and Hagar were hooking up, Sarai was actually probably there. Hagar was actually probably sitting on Sarai's lap. So, which was a custom that they did because this was supposed to basically be like Abram is with his wife, but we're just borrowing this extra womb over here. That's the way that it was done back then. Now, again, I want to say that was not God's idea, okay? So I'm not telling you, oh, that's what the Bible says, so y'all go home and have fun. Like, that's not what this is about, okay? This was their idea to follow that specific custom, which was not what God told them to do. And then Hagar got pregnant, okay? Now, this would have been terrible for Sarai for a couple of reasons. First of all, nobody wants to be in the room when something like that's going on with their husband, right? That's horrible in and of itself. But another reason why this was probably horrible was that Hagar got pregnant when Sarai couldn't. That means that the problem was not with Abram. The problem was with her, right? Because it worked with Abram and somebody else. So Sarai would have known that she was the one with the issue. So that would have been a struggle for her. But the other thing is that now Hagar, this Egyptian servant girl, someone who's very low on the totem pole, is now more of a woman and is blessed by God in a way that she was not. That would have been really hard for her as well. And as a result, Hagar starts getting a little snippy with Sarai. She starts looking down on her, kind of laughing, probably gives her looks like, hey, she's not having a good time with Sarai. And Sarai's over there just probably boiling and fuming at this point because of the way that Hagar is treating her now, okay? Here's your next fill in the blank, and this is a really important thing for all of us to understand. Taking control messes things up. Taking control messes things up. Now, I remember a couple of years ago, Tasha was addicted to nasal spray. Anybody been there before? Okay, one person, okay. All right, if you don't know this, nasal spray, which I love nasal spray. Every time I get a cold, I can't handle the feeling of not being able to breathe through your nose, so I use nasal spray. But Tosh has really bad allergies, particularly from our dog. So she would use nasal spray so she could breathe. But what happens is if you continually use nasal spray, it wears out like the lining of your nose, the membrane or whatever. And so it starts to swell up. And so you need to use more of it to open it up, which just damages the membrane more. And before you know it, your nose is constantly restricted and no amount of nasal spray will fix it. But you're still trying to snort that stuff up so that you can breathe. It's a miserable thing. The only way to break that, it's not really a chemical addiction, but just the physical reaction. The only way to break that is to stop using it. So the more you try to take control in that situation, like I want to be able to breathe, give me control, and you're just taking more and more and more, the more you try to take control in that situation, the less it works and the worse things get. And the only way to fix the problem is to stop trying to take control. That's exactly what it's like when it comes to following God. We want to take control and do it our way, but the harder we try to grip onto control, the worse it gets, and the less you realize that you actually have any control in the first place. So let's see what happens next here. They try to take control, things get bad. What happens in verse 5? And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you." What? "I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." That seems wrong. She's blaming Abram for the whole situation? Now, in some sense, I think Sarai is actually right here. And the reason why is because Abram is supposed to be the spiritual leader. He's supposed to be the one that when she comes and says, "Hey, I have this really dumb idea to have a surrogate mother," he should have said, "No, we're going to trust God instead. I'm not going to do that." She didn't force this on him. He willingly went along with it when he should have stood his ground and said, "No, we're going to trust God." So in that sense, she's right. This is Abraham's fault. But the other side is like, but wait a minute, this was Sarai's idea. How could she get mad at Abram because he went through with her idea? It seems unfair. Well, I'll tell you this. This is just a commentary on what's going on. God wasn't saying Sarai said this and she's right, this is Abram's fault. If the Bible spoke about who was wrong and right here, the Bible would say they're both wrong because neither of them was trusting God. Both of them was trying to do their own thing to take control, and it was wrong. So we got to make sure we don't shoot the messenger here. The Bible's just simply reporting the conversation because they're both wrong here. Let's go on to verse 6 and see what happens next. But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So here's the thing. Abram's in a tough spot. He has to choose between the woman who really didn't do anything wrong, except, well, I guess he was mean to his wife, right? But the child, his childbearer and his wife, he's caught between them. That's a rough spot. Nobody wants to be there. And I think that it's good that he chose to side with his wife. A good husband will usually side with his wife. However, I can't help but feel like when he says, "Do with her as you please," she's your servant, I feel like he's just kind of checking out. You know, like, it's your problem, go deal with her, do whatever you want. Rather than trying to get and be a peacemaker, realizing, I probably shouldn't have done this, and try to be repentant, he's kind of like, it's your servant, go ahead and do what you want. And so Sarai's like, and starts sharpening the sticks and stuff, like she's mad now, and she has permission to go do whatever she wants to her slave. Now, I can tell you this was probably not going to be a pretty situation. I don't know if you've ever heard of the word scorn before, but I'm pretty sure that's what was going on here. The definition of the word scorn is to feel or express contempt or derision for. We've all probably heard the phrase about scorn, right? William Congreve mentioned this in his play The Mourning Bride back in 1697, where we adapted the phrase, "Hell hath no fury," like what? Like a woman scorned. Okay? So now I'm thinking for a second here, imagining I'm Abram, right? And I'm married, and I get this other woman pregnant, even though it's her idea, and then she starts being mean to my wife, and I'm caught in the middle, and I'm thinking, this is going to get ugly. This is not going to be fun for anybody, okay? I'm thinking like there's going to be a lot of fires and explosions and crazy stuff going on here, and that's what's going to happen. And a matter of fact, that probably is what happens, because the next thing we see in the text is that Hagar goes, she's crazy, and she's out of here. Hagar's like, I am not sticking around because that woman is out of her mind, which is kind of understandable. But I will say this, from a result here, what we can really see what Sarai is doing, here's your next fill in the blank. Blaming others only makes things worse. Blaming others only makes things worse. But we have a habit of doing that, don't we, church? Whenever something goes wrong, like this used to bug me at the paper mill. This would always happen, right? Something would break down. We'd be down for hours. We'd lose all this money. Management would come in, and the first thing they would say is not what's wrong, what happened, how do we fix it? Their first question was, who did it? I want to know who's at fault. Who am I going to fire? Who am I going to, give off of work or whatever? Who am I going to punish? Because we have a tendency to want to blame when things go bad, right? I mean, what is the first thing that happens whenever something goes wrong in the political realm, right? Gas prices are high, the economy's bad, this is going on. First thing people are going to say is the president's name. His fault, he did it. They're not that powerful. But we always want somebody to blame because it makes us feel better. As long as it ain't my fault. I know a lot of people that are willing to go through the worst situation. They don't care about the situation as long as it's not their fault because we're so worried about blame. It's so much better if we look at a situation, instead of saying this is your fault, we say, how are we going to fix this? What are we going to do to make this better? Let's go on to verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her, this is Hagar now, by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where did you go? Where did you come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Just me? Okay. Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress, Sarai. She's fleeing from the presence of her mistress. Whatever Sarah did was so scary that she took off running. Now at this point, things have gotten too crazy, and God decides to intervene. When we take things further than God is willing to let them go, he will put a stop to it. He will. And so when I think about that, I think we also have to think about the flip side of that. When we go too far, God will stop us. But that means that whatever situation you're dealing with right now that might seem like it's too big or it's blown out of proportion or it's out of control, that if you're in that situation, God has not yet determined that it's too far. Wherever you are, even if it's challenging, God is okay with you being in that situation. And that should tell us something about where we are, that we have to learn to be okay even when we're uncomfortable. So let's go on here to verse 9. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Now this is probably a Christophany. Remember we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when Jesus comes before he, like the pre-incarnate Christ, shows up and interacts in Scripture before he actually comes as a baby in Bethlehem, all right? So that's probably what this is. This angel of the Lord, because they didn't have the name Jesus when they were writing this, would have said, hey, this angel of the Lord, and they're actually talking about the pre-incarnate Christ. And he shows up and he says, I will multiply your offspring. That's not something an angel does, right? This is something that God would do. And we'll see more evidence of this in a little bit. But he tells her to do something really interesting, something that we would not tell most people today. He says, go back to your abuser. Now, usually we would not advise that today. So I don't want you to look at this and think that that's what the text is saying. Oh, always go back to your abuser because God will give you more kids. Like, that's not what this is. What this is saying is, even in this horrible situation, God is saying, I'm in control, so you can go back because he's saying, I will protect you in this situation. All right, so this protection is being promised. All right. In really big picture, we need to understand this. Here's your next fill in the blank. Returning to God is the only answer. Whatever situation, no matter how bad it gets, the only way you're ever going to bring things back into some kind of sane atmosphere is to return to God. Repent of whatever you've done to get where you are and come back to the Lord. That's the only answer. It's not do more stuff or try to take more control or try to just change this. You got to come back to God if you're going to have some kind of victory. And it's interesting because it's almost as if God has now moved on with his challenge, right? It's like, okay, Abram, do this. Abram messed up. Sarai, do this. Sarai messes up. And now he's like, Hagar, how about you? Lowly Egyptian slave girl, low on the totem pole. Will you trust me? If only Abram and Sarai had held on to God's promises as tightly as she does, because Hagar listens and goes back. She listens to God and trusts him. And actually, he does end up fulfilling his promise because Ishmael ends up becoming the father of all of the Arabic people in the world, right? So all, Palestine, Syria, right? All the Arabic people that are still interacting with Israel today, like this was founded all the way back then. Let's look at what God says about this in verse 11. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael because the Lord has listened to your affliction. Okay, the name Ishmael means God will hear. That's why it says the Lord has listened to you. And the interesting thing is that God hears everyone at all times. He may not respond to everyone, but he can surely hear. From the lowest beggar to the sickest cancer patient to the wealthiest trust fund kid, God listens. And we should find comfort in knowing that he listens and that he cares. And in this case, God was listening and told Hagar specifically, go back to her. Go back to your master. Because she's going to have Ishmael. Let's learn a little bit about Ishmael here in verse 12. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So Ishmael is going to have it tough. And his descendants are going to have a lot of conflicts with his kinsmen, right? They're half-brothers, if you will, half-brother descendants, the Jews, which, like I said, is still going on today. All that stuff between Palestine and Israel and all that fighting and all that stuff is still going on thousands of years later, just like the prophecy says, even through today and into the future, all right? But the truth is, I find some hope in this passage, quite a bit of encouragement, and the reason why is because I realize that if God can take a wild, contentious donkey of a man like Ishmael and sustain him, then that gives me hope knowing that God can sustain this wild, contentious donkey of a man. And so there's comfort there in knowing that God reaches even those who are out of their mind. Let's go to verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. For she said, truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi, and it lies between Kadesh and Bered. So the evidence here of that Christophany is kind of even more cleared up, right? We see that she says, I have seen him who looks after me. It's not the angel looking after her, it's God, right? So she's saying she has seen God. She says, you are a God of seeing, right? Again, talking to the angel of the Lord. So this is not a regular angel. She's saying that this angel is God. Okay, so that's how we know that this is actually Christ. More than likely. Okay, so let's go on here, verse 15. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. Now, obviously here we see that Hagar was faithful to God and she obeyed his command. She went back, like she said. And what's interesting is that Abram chose to name the kid Ishmael, which would have been the request of the Egyptian slave girl, Hagar. Not even the person that would be considered the mother of the child. Remember, she's just the surrogate. Okay? So in this case, we actually see that Abram honored her. So that it seems like there was some sort of a peace that was made when she came back. As if like God probably brought some restitution here and said, you guys need to figure out how to get along for a while. Now, this isn't the first time that Abram and Sarai fouled things up. It's not going to be the last time that they messed it up. But here's the thing. What we can learn from this is what we need to do as Christ followers today is to wait on God's timing, to trust God even when it's hard. You know, I thought about this week because I think back to when I was, 16 or whatever, and I was learning how to drive. And I remember I'd be driving, and like if you watched my mom in the passenger seat as I was driving, it was comical because no matter what I did, every time I hit the brakes, it was like, oh my gosh, ripping down like the handles and breaking windows and rolling into traffic. Like she was terrified of everything I did when I was driving. And the funny thing is, like even today, like Tosh does the same thing when I drive. But it's usually a little bit different because normally like she won't be paying attention. She'll be looking at her phone and I'll tap the brakes and she'll look up and then that's like her first knowledge of anything that's going on. And so her first reaction is like, oh, what are you doing? And I'm like, stop, relax. I'm in control of the car. Like, what are you freaking out for? Now, I will say that like the common denominator there is me. So I realize that like I've probably earned the fear. I'm not going to lie. I'm not the best, most attentive driver. But it's frustrating to me because I'm like, relax. I'm in control. I see what's going on. I know what's going on. There's nothing to worry about. If you weren't looking at your phone, you wouldn't have freaked out when you looked up. And I have to wonder, because even me, who I'm definitely fallible, feels that way. I wonder how God feels when we react that exact same way when he's the one behind the wheel. He is in control. And we're over here freaking out. Oh my gosh, Lord, you're not going to fulfill your promise. Oh no. And we're freaked out. We're grabbing the wheel from him like, oh no. Like we're losing our minds over here freaking out. And I could just imagine God would turn over to us and be like, calm down. I'm in control. God has a perfectly clean driving record, never even bumped a curb. His driving record is perfect. He has never once messed up. And yet we're totally freaked out when it comes to us trusting him when he's in control. And honestly, church, that's where we have to change our mindset because trusting him is going to take a little bit of endurance. It's going to take some patience, some obedience, some discipline, some discernment, and maybe even a little bit of cooperation. But most importantly, we have to trust him. Your last fill in the blank is this. Trusting God can be uncomfortable, but it's right. That is what we're supposed to do, church. Because even when it looks like traffic is stopped and we're going to plow into the back of that big rig and explode into a fiery death ball or whatever, that's not the situation. Because God has never once made a mistake and he never will. So let's make sure, church, that as a church that we trust him and we continue seeking him and following him even when things are scary.